Thank you very much.
I just want to say again to you, Bob, how much I appreciate it. I know to one or two others today, but what it's meant for me personally to have such a wonderful cooperative relationship with you personally, and of course the superintendents, and the give and take. You're not afraid to ask tough questions when we get together, and I'm able to ask tough questions, so much so I know I've aggravated some of the superintendents over the years, but I really appreciate the dialogue, and it makes a difference to us in our analysis. And I'm sorry we had such a rushed time together, but our door is always open to you and your organization, and we look forward to many, many more conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael Borges, Executive Director, New York Association of School Business Officials. And after that will be Fred Cabell.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak, especially Chairman Farrell and Committee Chair Nolan and the rest of the panel here tonight. First of all, I just want to make sure that everybody in the room had received their school district fact books. That it's our third year of doing it. We hopefully find it very useful in determining what your school districts are getting. If there's any suggestions on making it better, please don't hesitate to contact us. Secondly, you should have gotten a letter in the last week or so from me about changes the legislature made to the tax cap last year, which have not been implemented by the Department of Tax and Finance. The two changes that you made were two technical changes that we have been advocating for the last 3 years that would allow BOCES capital expenditures to be included as an exclusion, and also adding pilot properties to the tax-based growth factor that would actually allow school districts, especially in a year where we're facing basically a 0% tax cap, will allow us to raise more revenue locally than we otherwise would. So far, we have not received any responses from Tax and Finance. I know many of you have contacted the department. Hopefully, you've gotten a response. If you've heard anything, that would be really helpful, because our school districts need to develop their budgets and submit their information to the State Controller's Office about our tax cap calculations by March 1st. And we really would like to be able to find out what is going on with the changes that you agreed to so far that the Governor and Tax and Finance has not implemented. In brief, again, the night is late, and I just wanted to touch upon some key points. We're all in agreement, whether it's ECB, ASBO, superintendents, school boards, the regents. The GEA has got to go. The fiscal rationale for having it no longer exists. The governor touts the fact that we're in great fiscal shape. The $434 million in GEA should be done away with. The legislature should really commit to phasing in of the foundation aid formula. It's high time. After 2007, here we are 8 years later. We're still not doing it. We're proposing an $800 million down payment this year, and then phasing in the rest over the next 3 more years after that. The executive proposal calls for $991 million in additional school aid, but in putting that into perspective, only $266 million is actually new money. If you look at our chart on page 2 of our presentation, you can see that over the last couple of years that the increases have been modest and increasing, but the fact that the bulk of the money is really for restoring the GEA, which is money that is already owed to school districts, and reimbursable aids, categorical aids, money that school districts have already spent that they're getting reimbursed for. So the amount of actually new money is in the blue, and so far the governor's only proposing 266 of that, and we think we can do better. Also, I want to point out that the STAR, no one's really talked about STAR tonight, and I just want to point out that the changes to STAR that the governor is proposing will have ramifications for school districts. Supposedly they are revenue neutral. They're just basically reimbursing taxpayers through their income taxes as opposed to their property taxes, but it will have an impact on property taxes. When taxpayers get their bill, they no longer see their rebate or their tax deduction for the STAR on their property tax bills, and they're going to look at their school district and say, why are my taxes going up by $400 or $600 or whatever their STAR rebate would have been? So we're kind of alarmed by that, and we hope the legislature will address that as well. No one has all talked about the minimum wage. We had done a survey of our members over the summer, I think, of the fall, when this first came out. We're not for or against the minimum wage increase. We just want to point out there are fiscal ramifications to school districts, to all local governments, about increasing the minimum wage, and someone has to pick up the tab for that. And last but not least, we also wanted to point out that even though school districts are doing a better job of being more efficient, our costs are still going up. I think on page 4 or 5 of our presentation, you can see that special funding or costs for special education continue to rise. Costs for teacher retirement have doubled since 2007, despite contribution rates fluctuating and going down. Healthcare, schools in New York State spend $6 billion a year on healthcare, and it continues to rise every single year. And our revenues have sort of been remaining kind of flat, and particularly this year with the 0% tax cap even flatter. So we are doing a better job of being more efficient. We just need more assistance, more help from the legislature and state to reduce our mandates, make us more even efficient, particularly in a year where we're having a 0% tax cap, and hopefully we can make up some for that difference in higher state aid from the state and recognizing that. So with that, I'll end, and if there's any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just thank you very much for those charts. They're great, thank you.
New York School Facilities Association, Fred Cobell, Chair Legislative Committee. Next person after him will be Dave Little.
Good evening.
Good evening.
New York State School Facilities Association represents, we have 600 members representing over 700 of New York's public school districts. We dedicate ourselves to providing, a clean, adequate, well-ventilated, well-lit space that says to the students and staff that what you do here is important. Just very quickly, we're asking for support for the New York State Facilities, Office of Facilities Planning. We thank you for the funding you gave last year, which helped increase their staff and get it back to manageable level. This year in particular, we're looking at the software system they run the whole office on. They purchased in 1987. It runs on DOS. I don't think I need to say anything more than that. Some of you may be old enough to remember DOS. So they're looking for. We'd encourage you to provide the funding for them to replace that system. I know literally to communicate from the facilities planning office to the state aid office, somebody copies it onto a disk and walks it down to the other office. So enough said. Okay. School safety funds, we thank you and appreciate that the New York Safe Act is in the executive budget to be extended this year. One thing we'd like you to look at and work on is how can we get that funding to BOCES schools? It's time to really look at a lot of things with the way BOCES is funded, but to say that those students and some of our neediest students don't get the same funding for safe schools, for cameras and other things, that's kind of hard. Also, we're looking for maintenance funding, asking for support for Assemblymember Engelbright and Senator Valesky's bill, which establishes minimum levels of maintenance for schools and makes that funding outside the cap. We're the stepchild. I mean, we've heard a lot of school districts today talk about the condition of their facilities. We struggled many days. When we look for solutions, we look for something that gets us by. There's a lot of things that if districts had the right funding, they could do that would reduce the annual operating budget. Things like energy performance and things like that. Speaking of BOCES one last time, capital projects within a BOCES, impossible to get them funded because how many school districts are going to say, yeah, let's go for that. I got a 0.15 or 1.2 cap myself. Let me give you some more money. We need to find a way to fund the capital projects for BOCES. I know Senator Marcelino and others worked on that this year, but it doesn't seem like it's moved along. Lastly, we're back again this year with an energy reserve fund, which is sponsored by Assemblymember Cahill and Senator Funke. What we're looking to do is establish another reserve fund for school districts to allow them to create a reserve fund for energy. If any of you sitting up here could tell me that a year ago you thought, like I gassed up before I left Long Island last night, I paid $1.89 a gallon. If anyone thinks they could tell me they thought they're going to pay that a year ago today, none of you would be here. You would have been speculating long ago. But we know the prices are going to go back up. I can tell you I budgeted a lot more money for energy this year than I'm going to need. This would have been a perfect opportunity to take some of that surplus this year, put it in a fund for when it comes back. It allows us to be a little more liberal in our fund and our budgeting. But, we're going to put fuel in the buses. We're going to heat the buildings. So when those spikes come, something else is suffering. We're just looking to get that cushion. A lot of what we've heard in the past, though, is, a reserve fund, try and get that past the executive. When we talk to the executive, a lot of reserve fund, try and get that past the controller. We talk to the controller. everybody's pointing fingers. I think this is the year to get it done and establish it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Little. And after that will be the New York State Congress of Parents and Teachers. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the legislators and esteemed staff behind them. Been there. We're not facing an economic crisis this year. We're not facing a programmatic crisis this year. The barrage of all of that has stopped, at least for now, but we're facing a legislative crisis this year. The signature law of the tax cap has created a circumstance for rural schools in particular that has taken the 2% increase that the governor has proposed, eliminated the funds at the local level so that in effect we have a tax freeze for the over half of the school districts that are rural schools in New York State. They have a teacher shortage because they can't attract quality personnel after the years of underfunding and the rhetoric, quite frankly, around the teaching profession. And it's very difficult to get young people to relocate to rural areas to begin with. And now I'm at least hearing every day of school districts that are having trouble trying to staff the subject matter that we need. The greatest crisis facing rural schools, because we do what we do well, very well. We have a very high graduation rate, but the breadth of curriculum that's allowed to be offered in rural schools because of the greatly restricted finances has made our students non-competitive with their suburban neighbors. And the other thing that I don't think that's generally recognized is that our rural schools have many of the same social problems that face our most dramatic urban areas. High teen pregnancy, high drug use for teenagers, high alcoholism rates and alcohol use for teenagers, and largely all for the same reasons, because we have nothing for them to do and no place for them to go after the last bell rings of the day. There's no funding left for that. This circumstance of the tax cap has left us dramatically underfunded to simply roll over our budget from last year to the present year. Education is a steady kind of cumulative process from year to year, and we can ill afford to have a funding stream that looks like an EKG chart. It goes up or down from year to year. We have local funds, we don't have local funds. We have a big increase, we have a big decrease. You can't systematically build a child's education from year to year using a funding stream like that. And rural schools have little to no ability to try and adjust for that because they raise so little at the local level to begin with. And there have been times in our state's history when it's been left up to our rural areas to try and bail out the rest of the state. We're at a point now, both legally with the Campaign for Educational Equity lawsuit and legislatively, where we're in a fiscal position now where we don't have a gap. We don't have a state budget. We're growing steadily. And I think all we would ask is that we allow our educational system to grow steadily as well. Because I think if you'll look, you'll see that virtually every other state in the union, the state pays for roughly 2/3 of what it costs to educate their children. And despite the fact that we're very fond of saying that we pay the most per child, we do pay the most per child because some of our districts can afford to pay astronomical amounts per child. But we have the worst distribution system in the nation for how we distribute that funding. And so we leave many of our children, a dramatic number of our children, in the lurch. If Brown versus Board of Education were our forefathers' great shame, then our funding system is ours. And until we address that, until we get the rates for places like Rochester and Buffalo, and quite frankly, for the educational breadth that we are not currently providing to our rural students, we're going to continue to face an uncertain future where people are exiting our state to the rate of about 150,000 a year. That's dramatic. The state of New York right now is exactly flipped from what every other state does. We're paying a little over 1/3, and we leave 2/3 to the local taxpayer. So if you're going to leave 2/3 to the local taxpayer, you better let them raise the money if you want your children to be competitive. Because right now, we've frozen what they're allowed to raise at that level, which means that even our wealthy districts are going to have to compete for that little amount of state funding that's out there with our most needy districts. That's inequitable. And so I would ask you to consider those things as you go forward. Governor's proposals have always been financially light in their initial proposal. It's always been up to you to fix it. I'd ask you to do it again this year. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Avenanti.
Thank you. I think you raised something that hasn't been really emphasized before. You're stating here, I think it should be made very clear to people what the implications are, that even in your schools that pay little towards their educational costs locally, increasing the amount that has to get paid up front through this star rebate program change could mean the defeat of your local budgets. Is that true?
There are a couple places within the governor's proposal where that's expected. Pre-K is an area of that, where schools are expected to pay the money up front and then get the money later on. That in this budget, there's an opportunity because of the banking funding, the banking fines, to be able to allocate a non-recurring revenue toward that so that school districts can participate in that. And the one that you mentioned, the Star Rebate Program, is the other. Yes, they can wait to get their rebate check off of their income taxes, but when they get their initial tax bill, where they used to see that being mitigated by the Star Rebate amount, they'll no longer see that, and so the amount that they'll look at to be paid up front is going to be greater, and they will, of course,
Well,
be
in
less
simple
supportive
terms,
of that.
people are going to think that you've imposed a 10% tax increase when in fact you're collecting the same amount of money, and they're going to come out and vote against budgets even though it's the same budget they approved the year before, because they're not going to know the details of all of this stuff.
And because all politics is local, they'll call their local school board members and administrators liars because what's on their bill is not what they were promised.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question. I'm sorry, I do have one question, Mr. Liu. I appreciate your testimony. We hear quite a bit from the larger urban areas, and I represent one, New York City, about the problems they have and the poverty rates and the, continued struggle to make sure students complete high school and are college ready / or employment ready. And I think one of the disadvantages you face in taking your pleas here to Albany is that we don't necessarily get the same kind of data because it's so many small, rural, high needs districts. Can you help me understand if somebody's done some research about the price your students are paying because we've been underfunding your schools?
I'm sorry, the what?
The price your students are paying because we've been underfunding the small schools. Are you seeing an increased dropout rate, a decreased rate of ability to graduate and be college ready or employable? Do you have anybody doing that kind of statistics?
First of all, as a resource, I would direct you to the Center for Rural Schools, which is actually a center for educational statistics for all schools. It can do remarkable things like predict your own district's performance, predict your future finances, things like that, predict and compare how you rate versus other districts demographically to your own. So that might be a good resource for you. The dropout rate for us is not as significant an issue as it is that the people that we do graduate don't have a degree that's worth nearly as much as their neighbors. I'll give you the perfect example. My son had over a 90 average and was rejected from a college specifically saying, Danny, you're okay, but I won't name the school district because I was school board president for 10 years there. And I thought we were doing well. But because of the lack of a breadth of curriculum, they said that the school district was not okay and that he would not fare well in trying to compete with the other people that they were admitting simply because he didn't have any context to put the information they wanted to give him into. And they were right, because the school that finally did admit him, he had a difficult time. He graduated, but for 4 years he had a very difficult time trying to use the information in a realistic way because he had no context to put it in. It was rote memorization for its own sake. And so I really think that the challenge for rural schools is not so much in staffing, because everybody in a rural area in the entire community is involved in the child's education. They know everybody, right? And care about everybody. That's the beauty of being there. but they can't help when there's not enough resources to be able to provide a competitive curriculum to go forward. And so they're being rejected for jobs and rejected for college applications. And so when that happens, it's a spiral for that rural community that's struggling, quite honestly, to keep its kids.
Thank you very much, and I'll follow through with that center. Thank you.
Thank you. New York State Congress of Parents and Teachers, Mark Egan, Capital Region Chamber. Is that it?
Richard Longhurst.
Which one are you, sir?
Who are you?
We have it, there's a little confusion.
You do.
You are?
I am Rick Longhurst. I'm the Executive Administrator of the New York State Congress of Parents and Teachers, or PTA.
Okay.
Okay. I was announced next, so here I am.
Yes, you are next.
Good evening. Many of my colleagues have spoken very eloquently about the inadequacies of state aid support in the executive proposal. I'm going to skip right over that. We share exactly the same concerns that they have stated, but I'm going to focus on just three things. And I'm going to begin by focusing on just what I see as a change in tone from a year ago or 2 years ago. Been here since 9:30 in the morning. And I've seen some very good examples of improvements in schools. I've seen some very probing and interesting questions that you have directed to the people who have sat at this table. And we see something different than what we've seen in the past. School districts this year, unlike last year, have access to state aid runs, which is very important for their planning process. The governor has accepted the recommendations of his Common Core Task Force that are positive, and that came together in a very short amount of time. So my compliments to those of you who participated in that process. The regents responded to those recommendations with their own regulations very quickly, promptly, and with some options that offer some real possibilities. And the state now has overall flexibility that they haven't had in the past to work with schools, with teachers, and parents as a result of the reauthorization of ESEA through the Every Student Succeeds Act. The next thing that I would like to address is two things that I haven't heard too much about today. But one is the area of family and community engagement. As we've listened to some of the people who've spoken, the need for collaboration between families and communities and their schools is threaded through a great deal of the reform efforts that you see described by everyone here, from struggling schools to the issues that are related to men and boys of color. The importance of family engagement and community engagement is critical. The regents have proposed programs that would address some of these issues, and we would urge your support for the creation of an Office of Family and Community Engagement within the Education Department. The inadequacy of family and community engagement over the past couple of years, in our view, may be partially responsible for the dissatisfaction that many parents have expressed through the lack of participation in federally mandated student testing for their students. The last thing that I would like to address is the area of fiscal support for the New York State Education Department. We believe that it's inadequate. We've looked at studies that, in at least one case, would suggest that the support for the state support for the New York State Education Department on a per pupil basis is 46th out of 51 in this country. Over the past 30 years, and my career goes back into the very early 70s, the state support for the State Education Department has been reduced, and the program assistance for schools is now almost nothing as compared with what it was 30-some years ago. As the diversity in the performance of our student population increases, we believe that the leadership on the part of the Education Department is critical, and we further believe that the money that you give to schools in the form of state aid is going to be more efficiently and effectively spent if you have quality leadership at the top to provide both support and monitoring from the State Education Department itself. Those are my comments. I have questions. I can respond to questions if you have them.
Yes, Mr. Roth.
Thank you. I see you mentioned something that a few others have, but many have not, and that's that regulatory work alone is not going to be enough to respond to some of the issues that were created by last year's policy initiatives in the budget. I was wondering, can you at all elaborate on what you would like to see from the legislative side to enable state ed to go and implement a lot of the recommendations of the task force?
Sure. You heard Jim Viola indicate a little while ago that the regulatory steps that the regions have taken were a patch, or what we would view as a workaround. At the same time, you will have heard others say that the provisions of the Reform Act that was adopted a year ago in 3012D need to be repealed. What is going to take some time is the process to involve the people and do the right thinking that gets the process more correct than it was the last time out. So we don't believe that the regulatory reform that is proposed by the regents is a long-term solution. Ultimately, the law will need to be changed, but it's a start, and it will give us the time to do the process the way it needs to be done.